back. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to 7 Kinds of Mischief. I'm your host, Stone Loki, and with me tonight is the one, the only, the Doctor of Dread and Despair, Adega Outlaw.
And the wannabe Ariel.
Hashtag
Hello, everybody.
Oh, greetings, everyone. Pod Racing Palpatine Project Storytime, Purple Valkyrie, Heiress of Chaos, Mark the Infinitely Tired, the Guardian of the Void, Lady Mist. Good evening, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. Louis Sparrow, Darth Haster. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. What do we have for
Research
tonight? Research.
This one is not so much any story as much it is little bits and pieces that you guys have gotten along the way. I am going to open your eyes up to part of a project that has been going on. Some of you, actually probably most of you, have heard of it to one degree or another. So we're going to get right into it. I had given Loki 3 videos, which we'll get to later. They're very short. And some pictures, and the pictures doesn't matter.
Videos?
Yeah, that one video I gave you has 3 little clips.
Oh, okay, cool.
And they're in order just in case, so you can pause it.
I haven't watched it yet.
Okay,
I want to be surprised.
Yeah, they're short. So the images doesn't matter that much. We'll talk about them, but what we're getting into tonight is, it's been called many different things over many different times, and you have seen celebrities over the years where they act one way and then suddenly somewhere down the line they change. There's story after story after story of this, and there's also some other
I've brought that up a couple of times, like people like Tom Hanks. I mean, Tom Hanks was so different when he was younger than what he's like now. It's like a total change in how they act.
Right. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. One reason I'm not going to get into, but one reason I will. And it usually has to deal, you wonder about why these children's stars go nuts after a while. I mean, how many times has Britney Spears acted like a schizophrenic, where one day she has purple hair and says she's English and has this friend and she wants people to avoid her. And the next day she shaves her head because she doesn't want to be controlled. And you have Kanye, where one day he's in a concert and he gets up and starts saying all the different terrible things about what's going on and hidden secrets and people that are doing things, and then they throw him in a hospital. What we're talking about is various forms of mind control, and one of them got exposed. You guys have heard about the dreaded, and I won't be able to see chat for a while. Sorry. Hello to everybody. This is about the dreaded MK Ultra, and people think that it ended. They just changed the name. That's what the government does. But let's go ahead and I'm going to read to you some of the things in case people don't know exactly what it is. This started before MK Ultra. Some people don't really realize that, but this is the one that we have. So Project MK Ultra was a series of CIA-led experiments on mind control. The experiments began in 1953. I can guarantee you they started a lot earlier than that with a different name, and continued into the late 1960s. CIA researchers subjected thousands of U.S. and Canadian citizens to experimental tests, including electric shock therapy, brain surgery, and LSD, which is one of their favorites, dosing in order to identify methods of controlling human behavior. Here's some of the main things that they did. It was, of course, CIA experiment. Most famous MK Ultra experiments involved LSD, but the program also tested the effectiveness of hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and brain surgeries. The experiments were conducted without the full consent of the subject. Many subjects were in vulnerable positions like incarceration or psychiatric treatment. The federal government was brought to trial several times as a result of the project. Concerns about Project MK Ultra led to an executive order stating that the experiment with human subjects must require affirmation consent. I want you to remember that, because affirmation consent deals with either parents with their children or consenting adults. And there's the key when it comes to children. Okay, CIA hoped for successful methods that could be used in interrogation tactics for alleged criminal or prisoners of war. And these experiments were conducted without the full consent of the participants, and the federal government was sued. Okay, we talked about that. But you can imagine they tell you it was for prisoners of war, that type of thing, but it's a lot darker. We'll get into it. Actually, I want to check and see. Yeah, there's pictures there. There's reasons for the butterfly and for the covered eye and things. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. In 1953, Alan Dulles, then director of the CIA, initiated the MK Ultra program. The reasoning was threefold. First, U.S. intelligence had learned that the Russians were testing a drug, this name's tough, bullpokopine, which was said to affect willpower in order to extract information from subjects. Second, during the Korean War, North Korea used LSD as an interrogation method on U.S. prisoners of war, and the U.S. sought to identify methods to counter such tactics. Third, the U.S. no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons and therefore wanted new methods of influencing leaders and extracting information. Sidney Goltieb, an American chemist who was known to take LSD himself, presided over the program as the chief of the CIA's technical services. The experiments primarily took place in penitentiaries, hospitals, universities, targeting people who could not fight back. Patients and inmates were given doses of LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs or subjected to electroshock therapy without consent, then experimented on for changes in behavior. Additionally, the CIA, this is a big one. This one goes back to the 40s as well, and they're saying it was only in the 50s. The CIA hired sex workers to dose unsuspecting clients in brothels, also known as Operation Midnight Climax, and even dosed their own agents during periods of experimentation. Here's some of the experiments. The most famous MK Ultra experiment. These are indefeatable. If you guys are worried about that, this is all part of government records. You can look it up. The most famous MK Ultra experiments involved LSD, but the program also tested the effectiveness of hypnosis, electroshock, and the things that we talked about. Because the CIA later destroyed documents relating to MK Ultra, most of what we know about the experiments comes from testimonies provided by experiment subjects. There are some documents left and some of the older stuff as well, but they tried their best to hide it. Farrell Kirk, a plaintiff in one of the lawsuits against the CIA, stated that the experiments with, sorry about the dog in the background, experiments with the LSD caused him to experience, this is kind of key too, extreme depression and drove him to attempted suicide. After his suicide attempts, he was questioned and studied again, then placed into solitary confinement. James Knight, who had been incarcerated for liquor smuggling, explained that the experiments gave him violent tendencies. Remember that as well, violent tendencies, and severe memory loss. Then you think of these mass shootings. Every time they wanted to do gun control in the United States, and then the mass shootings started up, and these guys wouldn't remember why or how these things happened, and yet they became suddenly violent. Makes you wonder. Before the experiments, all of his arrests were non-violent offenses, but afterwards he was arrested multiple times for assault. One particularly famous subject in the MK Ultra experiments was Whitney Bulger, a Boston crime boss, or Whitty Bulger. Bulger alleges that while incarcerated in the Atlantic Penitentiary, he was subject to experiments related to schizophrenia. Along with 8 or 9 other inmates, he was dosed with LSD and asked about crimes he may or may not have committed. Bulger described a rise in his own violent tendencies after the LSD experiments, as well as hallucinations and difficulty sleeping. Ted Kaczynski, you guys know him, better known as the Unabomber, who killed 3 and injured 23 with homemade bombs, was subject to MK Ultra test while a student at Harvard University in 1958. Dr. Henry Murray, tested his theories of behavioral modification and mind control on dozens of students like Kaczynski by subjecting them to extreme verbal abuse and then monitoring their reactions and turning them into unsuspecting weapons. I added that, but you figured it out already. Here's some associated deaths. At least 2 deaths are directly associated with the MK Ultra experiments. Those of Frank Olson and Harold Bluer. Olson's bacteriologist for the CIA Camp Dietrich in Maryland was unwittingly laced with LSD while at the CIA retreat. Due to his increased paranoia, he was sent to New York to be treated by the CIA psychologist. On November 28, 1953, he died after falling or jumping out of a 13th floor window. No one knows which. The family sued and they settled out of court, but there was no determination whether it was suicide or he was murdered. Holden Bluer was a patient at New York State Psychiatric Institute who voluntarily admitted himself to be treated for depression. While in treatment, he was unknowingly dosed with mescaline derivatives. I don't know what mescaline is, sorry. It's not masculine, trust me. It's mescaline something. One of which turned out to be fatal dose. The Institute identified the cause of his death as self-inflicted overdose. Bueller's family sued, and of course the same thing happened as the other one. Trials and aftermath. This is the last little bit I'm going to read before we continue on. Because the test subjects were either partially or entirely unaware of the experiments, and because the test resulted in a number of deaths and injuries, the federal government was sued and brought to trial several times over MKUltra. After the Watergate scandal led to greater overall scrutiny of government processes, the CIA destroyed many documents related to the MKUltra. By the time the trials, a few years later, there was not much paper evidence of the illegal experiments. In 1974, New York Times published an article about the CIA directing non-consensual mind control experiments. The report led to the creation of the Church Committee. And remember when we showed you the suicide gun a couple weeks ago that had the little dart that it would, or heart attack gun that could cause people to die from a heart attack? That was part of that Church Committee where they found that. They did that to investigate the nation's intelligence gathering programs and hold the Senate hearings. Victims of the experiments filed lawsuits against the federal government for human rights violations and neglect. These efforts led President Ronald Reagan to sign Executive Order 12333, which states that the research into humans basically could only be done if there was consent. And those of you who are parents, again, know that consent for children has to be done by parents. And you wonder why these mass shootings are done by children. Unwitting signatures on children so that they become subject to that. And right now you see a picture of different celebrities. And I briefly mentioned this before, but there's the Monarch Butterfly. You can look this up yourself and see how many times butterflies are sewn into gowns, put on tattoos, done into body art, whether it be paste on crystals or drawings or what have you, over and over in music videos all the time. The bottom left one has an Alice in Wonderland type setting, which is another cue. I mentioned rabbits. There's various other things where these people that have been put under mind control are given a little trigger and they become obedient. Something about mind control, will be a short video in just a second. It's only a few seconds long, that part of it. We'll get to it, not right yet though. You've heard of handlers, and I talked about, like Bob Hope and some of the Rat Pack who are handlers for basically slaves, but they have different types of handlers. Each one of these people you see here is presumed to have at least 2 handlers. One is for their performance, how they deal with public. And then there's another one that deals with because one of the side effects of mind control is the nervous breakdown, the incident like I mentioned with Kanye West when they put him into the hospital. Most people thought there wasn't anything to put him in the hospital for, but they stuck him in a hospital, and it was a handler who brought him in. All right. The first, we're going to go ahead and get into it. There's a couple of other images. Did you show the one with him covering the eye?
Yeah, give me just a second. And we've got the bin.
Yep. Why in the world would you see, and you can switch through the three of them.
There are more than this. I know you've got the Kylo one, but they've got Han, they've got Rey, they've got Luke, they've got Leia, all with something covering their eye. These posters, they came out with 3 of these posters like every movie. The very first movie, it was Finn, Rey, Han, and Kylo, but it wasn't like Ben. It was the mask with the red saber over it.
Right.
But he had the blue lightsaber. Rey had her staff. Han had his gun. All of them covering up that eye. All of them covering up the right eye. So they came out
since
with
Disney took over.
Yes, ever since Disney took over. Because I saw these and I was like, man, I got to tell Adega. I didn't know if you knew that or not. Every single movie had posters like this.
Yep. My son has one of them.
Oh, and there's the Rise of Skywalker one.
Yep.
But yeah, there are more. They're not just those 2. There's a bunch of those.
The one it doesn't look like it's going to show up very well on yours. The collage.
I'll make it bigger.
It kind of blurs out, but on there are all the different celebrities. I was telling Loki just before we started, a band that I used to absolutely love was U2 until something happened and changed. And he was telling me about Metallica doing the exact same thing. Something changed. And that's when you started seeing the posters or the pictures of them covering one eye. Yep. It's a sign that they have been conditioned, or they are willing participants in something dark and something that's controlled. They're no longer free to do the creative works that they wanted to do. They now are part of a program, and they get extremely wealthy for it, but they're also controlled. All right, let's show the first little clip. It'll zoom in, and then it will fade out. As soon as it fades out, go ahead and shut it off. I don't want it to fade into the next one.
Give me just because I got to change the way. Okay, you want audio, yes?
Yeah. All
right.
These is something I made. These are older clips.
I think that, this is a culture of fear, and nobody's more afraid than people in Hollywood. They're afraid that they'll drop out of the top, they're afraid that they'll drop from the bottom of the pyramid, maybe to the middle of the pyramid. But, they're the ones, Hollywood is the one that keeps all this power structure and all this culture of racism and sexism and classism and genderism and all of it in place.
And we don't have that next door. It's all in Hollywood.
They make a lot of money doing it. And they do it at the behest of their masters who run everything. So, they're not going to get brave enough to do that. I mean, I think that there aren't many of us who are brave enough to do that. And I'm just, I'm lucky that I can do it, and I feel that I do it on behalf of many people in Hollywood too. I go to Hollywood parties, or occasionally I go to Oscar parties and things like that. And people, big stars, people will grab me by the arm and take me aside and say, "I just want to thank you for the things you say." And it blows my mind, but that's the culture. It's a culture of fear for sure. And it's a big culture of mind control too. MK Ultra mind control rules in Hollywood. If you don't know, Google that and look into it.
All right, go ahead and pause that.
Yep.
That's just one of the people. I'm trying to remember Dennis Quaid's brother.
Yep, Randy Quaid.
He talked about this at one point, and then he called the enforcers whackers.
Yep.
You wonder why there's so many deaths in Hollywood, or people that break down, mentioning these whackers. that go on. Now, here's something I was mentioning, the mental breaks, the snaps, when these guys that have been controlled, something happens to them, something sometimes quite public. The next video is one. Some of you may have seen this, some of you may not. And it's a lot longer than what I have here, but you can see what happens. Go ahead and play the next little bit.
Notice
Al Roker on the left.
make it real awkward.
That's exactly how
You have to have a certain amount of distance between
Yes,
the bodies.
exactly.
And you're high.
Yes, like they say in Catholic school, leave room for the Holy Ghost.
The Holy Ghost. Keyword.
Anyway, there is a lot of it's a memory.
He's gone.
Actually, it's a big
Just
day
out.
in music history.
35 years ago today,
This lasts for quite a lot longer than what I do with the video. They had to make other news reports to try and explain what had happened to him. They made all kinds of excuses, but he had zoned out. And you'll find other celebrities who do the same thing. Even politicians will do the same thing. Some key word, something pops, like he heard ghost, and boom, he was gone. You wonder about the Monarch Butterfly, or about the rabbits, or Alice in Wonderland, or Wizard of Oz. These are phrases and words that they use that will automatically set these people into this mind control. And they are either prepared to act a new way or receive new instruction. That's just how it is. Some of you may think it's far-fetched, and I could see some of you know, and there's even people that I know that have friends that have been conditioned, and taking them to a movie, they have to watch them because they will snap at some phrase, some image, boom, they change into a new person, almost like a multiple personality, because that's what it is. They put in another personality that is prepared to do whatever the handler wants them to do. All right, let's get the last little clip here.
As a handler, this person who, or individual, or
This is the country music artist
human sort of
coming up.
person would inflict control upon your life. Who is controlling them?
The handlers that I had were associated with the CIA, but most of all, my owner in MKL for mind control was U.S. Senator Robert C. Byrd. Senator Byrd directed my activities. He's the one who decided who my handlers would be, and he chose different handlers for certain purposes. My first handler, for example, was for trauma. My second handler was primarily for being able to travel throughout the United States and the Caribbean and Mexico, Canada, and the country music industry. So he chose them according to what they could provide. And as a handler, they followed Senator Byrd's orders, but they were already still associated with the CIA.
That is absolutely insane.
So some of these movies that I've shown you and some of this stuff, it's hopefully opening your eyes that, there's a reason why a lot of Hollywood is dark and twisted. It's because it's controlled by people who are trying to present a message to you. There's a reason why incidents of bombings, shootings, different things happen at specific times that seem the most inconvenient, but more convenient for people who have political or social agendas. There's a lot of hidden control in the background, and the proof is there. I'm exposing you to some of it. There's a lot more. And a lot of things I will never, ever talk about here, simply because I have had, and you guys know, I've had experience with people who know, have seen, have access to. But I just wanted to share with you, never, ever blindly follow. Open your mind and think for yourself. Trust yourself and trust your feelings, because if something feels off, we can talk about that sometime. If something feels off, it probably is off. If something doesn't sound right, probably isn't right. Just as long as you're not closed-minded or been trained to think a certain way. But just know that some of our celebrities and heroes, like Ellen DeGeneres, they claim that she's a handler. Frank Sinatra. I talked about, Bob Hope. There's
Yeah.
politicians now that are in control of these things, and you know who they are. I don't have to tell you. But I will show you that these are not coincidences. Why do you see butterflies all the time? It's because or if you see people's, and we showed you with the Rothschilds with the cage over the head, why do you see them a lot of times in cages on these music videos or in different shows, or have them around their face or behind bars? Why do you think, I'm really going to throw this out, and you could take it or leave it, because I know some of you are going to hate me for this, because masks don't work. But why do you think they're asking us all to put on masks? Just a thought. Doesn't mean I'm drawing any conclusions. But it puts you behind your own little cage. I'm done.
The Adega's done. Thank you so much, brother. Anytime you come up with the MK Ultra stuff, I'm like, holy shit, here we go. Here we go. All right, so guys, the tale I have for you today is the strange case of Edmondson, Kentucky. Adega may know something about this. I'm not sure if he does or not. But here we go. This is from Creepypasta, as always.
I think I do know this one.
On October 16th, 1962, every man, woman, and child disappeared from the town of Edmondson, Kentucky. The date is relatively easy to pin down. The day before, October 15th, traveling salesman named Arnold Johnson passed through the small town in an unsuccessful attempt to sell an exciting new product, the bagless vacuum cleaner. During an interview with authorities afterwards, Johnson said he noticed nothing unusual about Edmondson in the day before the disappearances. He did, however, remark that none of the housewives he spoke with during his brief stay seemed even remotely interested in his product, something he found surprising compared to the response typically received when demonstrating the vacuum cleaner to similar-sized towns. Not only did I not sell a single vacuum cleaner, but no one even wanted to see the product in action, he said during the interview. If you could get in the door and show the women what that vacuum could do, you were guaranteed a sale. Johnson chalked up his failure to apprehension related to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had begun a day before and had been dominating the airwaves. It's hard to sell a vacuum cleaner when your audience thinks there's a possibility there'll be radioactive dust by the end of the week, he said. Johnson left the town of Edmondson the evening of October 15th. The next town on his sales route, Clement, was 80 miles away. He drove all night and didn't think about Edmondson until investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation knocked on his door 2 weeks later. During the early morning hours of October 17th, Randall Pierce, a farmer who sold his produce to the only grocery store in Edmondson, drove into town to discover empty streets and closed storefronts. It was eerie, Pierce told the county newspaper later. Usually at 7 a.m, that little town was bustling. I thought I had maybe driven up during a holiday. Pierce lived with his wife and 3 children on a farm 15 miles outside of Edmondson. Like most farming families in the early 1960s, Pierce's wife homeschooled their children when they weren't helping their father tend the farm. But I couldn't think of any holiday that would close up a town in the middle of October. So I started getting a little spooked, Pierce said. I knocked on the doors of a few houses and didn't get a response from any of them. Around 8 o'clock, I realized there wasn't a single soul in Edmondson. Shaken and a little disoriented, Pierce returned home to his wife and children. He told them what he had seen or not seen in Edmondson, and with nationalistic fears of a communist invasion running rampant, his wife convinced him to drive to Clement and report what he had seen to the authorities. Pierce's family had no phone at their farm. Pierce arrived in Clement shortly after noon and immediately pulled into the parking lot of the local police department. He told the authorities what he had witnessed in Edmondson. Initially, as Pierce tells it, his story was met with disbelief and ridicule. But after multiple calls to Edmondson's police chief, Clement Sheriff Jonathan Ambrose gathered a group of men and traveled to Edmondson to investigate Pierce's claims. Sheriff Ambrose died of lung cancer in 1968. However, in spite of being a veteran of both World War II and the Korean War, on his deathbed, Ambrose said that his visit to Edmondson on October 17th was the most disturbing and haunting experience of his life. And thinking about the events of that day would still turn the blood in his veins ice cold. According to the most recent census, 236 individuals lived in Edmondson in 1960. It was a small town nestled between the hills of western Kentucky, named after a captain who killed during the Battle of 1812. Edmondson was populated primarily by the ancestors who founded the town in 1825. Edmondson had one public school, a grocery store, a bank, a hospital clinic, 2 churches, and a post office. Most of the men worked small farms like Pierce or ran a trade. Edmondson, like most small communities in rural areas, was self-sufficient and self-sustaining. Every 2 weeks, the grocery store would be restocked and the post office would deliver mail every Tuesday. For entertainment, residents of Edmondson would have to visit Clement or any other nearby town. On October 17th, 1962, Clement Sheriff Ambrose, 2 deputies, and the Clement's primary physician piled into a squad car and followed County Farmer Randall Pierce back into Edmondson. Ambrose carried his service pistol, M1 911A145 ACP, and ordered his deputies to bring their shotguns, Browning 12-gauge pump actions. The physician, Alan Caffey, was brought along in case a mass casualty event had taken place. Before he died in 1968, Ambrose recounted the events of October 17th to his older son, who transcribed his father's testimony and published it in a men's magazine to little fanfare in 1974. It was a 2-hour drive from Clement to Edmondson. We all expected to show up in that little town and find nothing wrong except for a drunk police chief who overslept his shift. However, I couldn't deny the fact that a palatable tension was present in the squad car. My 2 deputies kept fiddling with their shotguns. Kathy wouldn't stop rummaging through his physician's bag. It was the same type of behavior I observed among soldiers before we were set to launch a big assault. Upon arriving in Edmondson, they immediately realized something was, in fact, very wrong. Pierce and Ambrose parked their cars in front of the grocery store along the main street. It was just as Pierce had described it. The town seemed completely devoid of life. Ambrose, who personally knew Edmondson's police chief and where he lived, decided they should check out his home first. The 5 men set out on foot into the residential neighborhood. All the men were struck by the silence. It was then that one of the deputies realized that not only were there no people in town, there were no animals to speak of. Yards with fences that clearly meant to keep in dogs were notably empty. The men arrived at the police chief's home to find the front door unlocked. Ambrose, with his gun drawn, entered the house first and was followed by his 2 shotgun-toting deputies. I don't know what we were expecting to find. I honestly thought we'd find a body. Maybe poisonous gas leaked from the ground at some point during the night and killed off the whole damn town. But I think what we found, it was worse. Police chief's house was empty. Bed was made up in the bedroom and the fridge still contained bottles of fresh milk. The men were baffled. Maybe they thought the townspeople had left to attend a large community picnic. But as the hours dragged on and the search continued, that possibility grew less and less likely. We searched 6 other houses in the neighborhood after we canvassed the police chief's house, Ambrose said. It was always the same story. The house seemed fine. No sign of forced entry, unlocked doors, and absolutely no occupants. However, a few similarities began to make themselves apparent as the men made their way from house to house. For one, there was no luggage to be found anywhere in the house, and it appeared as if a majority of the clothing was missing from drawers and wardrobes. Pierce, the farmer, also noted that much of the food left in the pantries and refrigerators were perishable. There was no canned goods. Ambrose, who had just finished reading C.S. Lewis' The Great Divorce, remembered thinking, "It's as if the whole damn town just packed up their belongings and boarded a bus to heaven." Some of the discoveries were less benign. In the backyard of one home, the men discovered a dead Labrador retriever. One of the deputies stumbled across the animal and thought at first it was sleeping. The dog was wearing a collar and was loosely chained to a tree in the backyard. It was the first animal they'd seen in Edmondson since arriving 2 hours before. While the men searched the home, Kathy, the physician, performed an ad hoc autopsy on the animal. Rigor mortis had only recently set in, indicating the dog had not been dead for more than a day. Additionally, Kathy found raw hamburger meat in the animal's stomach. Hamburger meat that had been peppered with small white pills. The dog had been poisoned. In another home, they found the words Revelation 9:1 scrawled on a bathroom mirror in light pink lipstick. The men were unfamiliar with the Bible verse, and this led to the next disquieting discovery. They could not find a single Bible in town. Edmondson had 2 churches, and it can be deduced that a majority of the township probably attended one or the other. In the early 1960s, a vast majority of Americans considered themselves Christian, and even though those wouldn't consider themselves very devoted, could be expected to at least own a Bible. However, Ambrose's men couldn't locate a Bible in any of the homes they searched. When they inspected the churches, they found only hymnals or books of common prayer in the pews. Not one single Bible. Except for the poisoned dog during their 3-hour search of Edmondson, they found no signs of violence or struggle. Every home's interior looked impeccable, and running water and electricity appeared to be in working order. Ambrose was reminded of the model communities the U.S. Army had built in New Mexico to test the destructive power of the atomic bomb. As the sun began to slip beneath the trees, and the men's shadow grew longer and dimmer, Ambrose detected another palpable sense of urgency brewing among members of his group. It was obvious that men didn't want to remain in Edmondson after sundown, Ambrose said. And I felt it too. I somehow sensed that if we stayed in Edmondson overnight, there'd be another group of men from Clement trying to find us next afternoon. And I don't think they'd ever found us. Before twilight ended, the men loaded up in the cars, the 2 deputies, Kathy and Ambrose, in the squad car, and Pierce in his truck. And they left Edmondson. Even though they knew the town was empty, each man reported a creeping sensation that they were being watched from the darkened windows of the homes they passed on their way out of town. We didn't talk much on the ride back to Clement, and I'd be lying if I said I was driving with any regard toward the speed limit. We had to get out of that town. At that point, I was convinced we had stumbled across ground zero of some new communist weapon system. Something that could vaporize the inhabitants of an entire town without causing any collateral damage. But even then, I knew that story didn't completely add up. After the men arrived back in Clement, they agreed that Ambrose would contact the federal government in the morning. None of the men expressed any interest in returning to Edmondson. That night, Ambrose retrieved his family's Bible from their study and flipped to Revelation 9:1. And the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven onto the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit. I didn't know what to make of that, Ambrose said. The next morning, Ambrose reported what he had seen in Edmondson to the governing authorities in Frankfurt. Things began moving very quickly after that. While the rest of the world was transfixed by the escalating tensions between Cuba and the United States, the FBI sent an investigation team to investigate the disappearances at Edmondson. Fearing a communist plot, or, as Ambrose had suspected, the use of a powerful new weapon, the FBI shut down access to Edmondson on October 19, 1962. The strange case of Edmondson made its way into a few local papers, but it was a story that always ended up being buried behind pages of international news, because many of the town's inhabitants were ancestors of the people who founded the town. There weren't too many relatives inquiring about the status of their loved ones. The roads that passed through Edmondson, there were very few, were rerouted around the town. The FBI finished their investigation in 1967, but by then no one really cared about Edmondson anymore. In between the town's disappearance in 1962 and the FBI's final report on the incident, the nation's attention had been distracted by a number of earth-shattering events: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the burgeoning civil rights movement, and the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam. Unfortunately, the results of the FBI's investigation were sealed and deemed confidential. As the decades progressed, nature began to overtake Edmondson. No attempt was made to rebuild or resettle the town. Edmondson soon became a little-known historical footnote in Kentucky's history. While many of the structures collapsed due to exposure, a handful of homes and one of the churches remained standing, enshrouded by thick vines and a thriving deer population. In 2002, the official report from the FBI was made public after a local historian placed a Freedom of Information request. Dennis Miller, president and sole member of the Edmondson Historical Society, learned the FBI officially declared the reason for the town's spontaneous abandonment as fears related to the possibility of nuclear annihilation, an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon, led to a panic-induced dispersal of the town. Of course, that reason was bullshit, Miller said. The report doesn't even mention the fact that none of the townspeople had ever been accounted for. Not one. There were no reports of atmospheric phenomenon by anyone in the area. However, by then, a new theory had emerged regarding the fate of Edmondson inhabitants. A theory that began circulating after two self-proclaimed backyard adventurers stumbled upon a hatch in the basement of the abandoned First Baptist Church of Edmondson. The Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the world's largest known cave system. These 400 miles have been mapped. Some scientists estimated there could be another 600 miles that are unexplored and have never been seen by human eyes. As of 2016, 26 entrances into the cave system have been discovered. And in 1981, one of those entrances was discovered in the ruins of Edmondson, Kentucky. During the late 1970s, the abandoned ruins of Edmondson attained a cult status among backpackers and hitchhikers in the area. With the roads leading to Edmondson in disrepair, getting to the abandoned town was extremely difficult. But every year, intrepid amateur adventurers and curious locals would make the trek to one of the country's greatest but forgotten unsolved mysteries. 19 years after the disappearances, hiker Emilio Stevens and Julio Page parked their vehicles 30 miles outside the edges of the forest that surrounds the abandoned township and began their trek to Edmondson. "We'd visited Edmondson 2 years before that day," Stevens said to Scientific Journal afterwards. "It is creepy as hell. It takes about a day and a half to reach the town from the trailhead, and when you get there, you really don't feel like sticking around. Most hikers pass through it or camp overnight on the outskirts. That November, Julio and I planned on staying overnight in the church. I think it was more about testing our nerves than anything else." Church Stevens is talking about is the First Baptist Church of Edmondson. It's the largest structure still standing in town. The grocery store and Methodist church collapsed in the late 1960s. "We arrived in Edmondson around nightfall on the second day," Stevens said. "Julio wasn't feeling too hot and it was beginning to sprinkle. We set our tent in the center of the church and prepared for our night. I could tell it was going to be a miserable night. The roof of the church leaked and a lot of the pews had been destroyed by vandals and raccoons. As they settled in for the night, Stevens and Page both could shake a creeping sense of dread. Even though they had hiked into Edmondson before, they both felt unprepared for the degree of uneasiness they were experiencing. Around midnight, exhaustion got the better of the two, and they fell asleep. 2 hours later, Stevens awoke to a loud cracking sound. I first thought it was thunder, but then the floor slanted and we were falling, Stevens said. There is nothing more disorienting than waking up in a tent and experiencing the sensation of free fall. The floor of the church had collapsed in the middle of the night, flinging Stevens and Page into an as of yet undiscovered basement. Luckily, both Stevens and Page survived the fall without any serious injury. We were both pretty shaken and, frankly, a little banged up, Stevens said. But in all the time we had spent around Edmondson, we had never heard of a basement in the Baptist church. We knew we had found something no one else knew about. Armed with only their flashlights, Stephen and Page set to exploring the decrepit basement. The room hidden beneath the floorboards of the church was small and appeared to have been carved into the bedrock beneath the building's foundation. Stephen said there wasn't much to see. It looked as if the room had been used to store extra tables and chairs, presumably for after-church socials. But then they found the hatch. Page found it in the far corner of the basement. It was set flush against the floor, and it was made of 4 thick wood planks, and the hinges had been bolted into the bedrock on the left side. The door had one of those old-fashioned drop ring handles. Stevens gripped a hold of the drop ring handle and, after several tries, wrenched the hatch open. A square of darkness stared back up at him. Page activated and dropped a glow stick into the shaft. Pale green glow of the stick stopped about 5 feet from the mouth of the hatch. Well, we've got to go down there, Stevens said. It's probably 3 in the morning, and we sure as hell wasn't going back to sleep. Stevens tied a climbing rope to his backpack and dropped down through the hatch. Page stayed above, metered out the rope as Stevens progressed into the darkness. At the bottom of that shaft, a passageway opened up to my left, pointing westward. It was obvious by then that I was traveling through a cave tunnel and that it was not man-made. Eventually, the tunnel tightened and Stevens found himself crawling on his hands and knees. The roof of the passageway scratched his back and his hands began to get rubbed raw by the cave's rough floor. I'm not claustrophobic, but it started getting pretty tight. I began to worry about not being able to turn around and get back to the hatch, but I started to hear something coming from up ahead. I should have been freaked out, but at that point, I figured I had gone too far to bail out now. After 15 minutes of crawling, Stevens was straining to push his shoulders through the ever-tightening passageway, but the eerie noises emanating from ahead drove him deeper into the cave. However, his adventure came to an abrupt end. The passageway ended at a pile of rocks. Each rock looked to be about the size of my head, and they completely blocked any further spelunking. I could hear the noises clearly now. I could even distinguish words and phrases. But my journey, it was over. However, right before the passageway terminated at the cave-in, Stephen found a couple of objects. He put them in his jacket and began backing out. It took him 30 minutes to back up out of the passageway. When he made it out to the shaft and back into the church's basement, to a relieved Page, he took out the objects and inspected them. I'd found a pair of eyeglasses, like old-fashioned readers. A woman's shoe. It didn't mean anything to us at the time. Stevens and Page hiked out of Edmondson early the next morning, battered and spooked. When they reached their car, they immediately headed into Mammoth National Park and reported what they had found to a park ranger. The investigation that followed, it was determined that Stevens and Page had discovered an entrance to an unmapped portion of the Mammoth Cave system. Unfortunately, geologists determined that the cave-in had stopped Stevens' progress was at least 100 feet thick. Unless they used explosives, There was no way to investigate any further. However, it was the discovery of the cave entrance, coupled with the objects that Stephen found, that held disturbing implications for the unsolved mystery of the disappearance in Edmondson 20 years prior. Historians dated the eyeglasses and the woman's shoe to the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Most historians and geological experts are now in near unanimous agreement about what happened to the inhabitants of Edmondson. Driven by fears of a first strike by Cuba during the missile crisis and religious fanaticism, the people of Edmondson sought refuge in a secret labyrinth cave system underneath the town. Unfortunately, a cave-in, perhaps triggered by their panicked influx through the tight passageway, trapped every man, woman, and child deep underground. It's deeply unsettling when you realize that at the same time Sheriff Ambrose and his men were exploring the town, that everyone they were searching for was probably about 400 feet underneath them, said Sam So, ranger at Mammoth National Park. They had had fresh water and food, and if the cave had a clean air supply, some experts believe that the people of Edmondson could have survived for at least 6 months underground. I reckon it's a pretty good theory, Stevens said, but it still doesn't explain what I heard that night. The reason I dropped down through that hatch and crawled on my hands and knees for 15 minutes doesn't explain the singing I heard. While I was crawling down there, I clearly heard voices singing, "Come Thou Fount." Dennis Miller started the Edmondson Historical Society in 2001 to raise awareness about the town and the mystery surrounding it. He was 12 years old at the time. Really is 20th century Roanoke, Miller said, referencing the New England colony that disappeared in 1592. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to figure out what happened. Miller lives in Clement, and on his days when he's not reaching Edmondson, he runs a small pawn shop. Many people would consider Miller's fascination with Edmondson to border on obsession. But when they learn about Miller's personal history with the area, it begins to make sense. During a family camping trip in 1997, Miller's father and mother went missing after making camp in the wilderness 3 miles north of Edmondson. Miller, who was 7 at the time, was with them when they disappeared. "We camped often, and we used a big tent for the 3 of us," Miller said. "That night, we went to bed around 9 after cooking hot dogs. I woke up around 1 in the morning and realized my parents weren't in the tent anymore. And the front flap, it was open." Miller spent 2 days alone in the woods, never straying far from the campsite in case his parents came back. After sustaining on hot dog buns and marshmallows, he was discovered by another camper passing through the area. After searching the area for 2 weeks, police officially concluded that I had been abandoned in the woods by my parents. But that's not true. My parents loved me. I never doubted that. If they had abandoned me, why didn't they hike to their car? It was found untouched at the trailhead. After the investigation closed, Miller spent the next decade of his life in and out of foster care. Driven by a desire to protect his parents' reputation and validate their love for him, Miller began reviewing historical records in libraries and did a sweep of the police records in the surrounding area. Some might accuse Miller of attempting to connect unrelated dots, but some of his data and findings are shocking, to say the least. For example, the 3 counties that border the location of Edmondson have a missing persons rate 17 times higher than similar-sized counties in the United States. It's an area we sometimes refer to as the Kentucky Triangle, said FBI agent Brittany Hooper, head of the state's missing person division. For some reason, a lot of people seem to disappear in those counties. Some of the disappearances can be attributed to caving accidents, vast swaths of unmapped wilderness, the recent boom of meth operations in rural areas. Also, Stephen wasn't the first person to report hearing strange voices and singing in and around the Mammoth Cave system. Some people consider Mammoth National Park to be the most haunted national park in the United States. There have been dozens of accounts of people hearing strange noises in the woods and caves since the 1970s, as well as sightings of a tall, humanoid-like creature called the Black Demon, according to unrelated local lore. Geologists and historians dismiss many of these accounts. After Stevens told authorities he had been following the voices of singing as he made his way through the passageways, expert cavers were quick to point out that even if he had heard people singing, it could not have come from behind the cave-in rocks. The cave-in was too thick for sound to penetrate. Also, because Mammoth National Park sits on top of Mammoth Cave System, it's not unreasonable to assume that a lot of the strange noises and voices are a result of sound bouncing and echoing throughout the caverns. Caves are, after all, notorious for their disorienting acoustics. But Miller has a different theory. A theory is macabre, and it would be revelatory if it turned out to be true. I think some of the trapped people of Edmondson are still alive, Miller said. I think they're down there in an unmapped portion of the cave system, and that have chosen to stay below. It's been about 70 years since they went in, which means the first generation has probably died off, and there's an entire second or third generation that only knows life underground. As for the disappearances, Miller has an answer for that as well. I think they've found other exits, and every now and then they come out and just take people. Hikers, drifters, campers, locals. I think that's what happened to my parents. It has been happening years before they were taken, and it continues even today. On his off days, you can find Miller searching the forest around Edmondson and the outskirts of Mammoth National Park for additional entrances into the Mammoth Cave System. He carries a GPS locator, rappelling gear, multiple flashlights, and a Colt 45 automatic pistol. For some reason, they won't want to be seen by us, Miller said. I don't know what they do with the people they take, but I know what it takes to maintain an underground society. It requires food and a fresh gene pool. I don't like thinking about what that meant for my mom and dad, but even if the truth is ugly, at least I'll know, and I'll be able to do something about it. In spite of being armed, and as soon as the sun begins to slink behind the trees, Miller makes sure to abandon his search and head back to his vehicle. You'll never find me spending the night in those woods again, Miller said. Wow.
Yeah. And real.
And real.
That reminds me of I haven't looked at chat. It reminds me of, I think it's the second Poltergeist movie where the priest took his people underground.
Yep.
And started haunting the place. I wonder if that was inspiration for that movie.
It might be. It very well might be. But yeah, I no Bible left in town. All that's true. All that happened. That's not made up. That's not just a story from Creepypasta. That is a fact, Jack. What they're dealing with there, where those people are, God only knows. But yeah, if there is a civilization of people down there, they need food and they need stock. Because you can't just keep having the same babies with the same people. You get some crazy ass people that way.
Oh, yeah.
More locks.
Try and sleep good with that one, folks.
Yep. Have a great night, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you sleep well. I know I will. Lock your doors, board your windows. Yeah. I'm sure probably people right now is like, this is why I lock my doors and lock my windows and walk around and check the shit 3 times before I go to bed. I bet it is.
And check your basement for trapdoors.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight, brother. Thank you for doing this with me.
Always fun.
Great time. Absolutely great time. You guys take care. We will be back tomorrow morning. It's going to be myself, Purple Valkyrie, Dave Bob, and Loriana Creel. I am not sure. We may have one more guest. I don't know. I'm going to have to check my messages and see exactly. Probably just going to be us. So check us out tomorrow. We're going to be talking John Carpenter movies, the best of John Carpenter. This is going to be our new best of series on Fridays. Everyone take care. Can't wait to see you. Have a great night and sleep tight.
Good night.
These videos are tremendous. Like, comment, and subscribe, and hammer that notification bell.